All right, I'll go ahead and get us started. I'm really excited to see all the interest in this morning's topic. I'm very glad that you're all with us. My name is Kim Porter. I'm the executive director. Be a part of the conversation. Today, we're talking about understanding relapse syndrome. I'm very excited for you to meet our presenter, who I'll give you a little background on in just a moment. I want to thank our sponsors for this event, the Montgomery County Office of Drug and Alcohol. So thank you very much to Montgomery County for funding this program. That's why we can offer this CEU event at no charge to you. You can submit questions at any time just as presenting. Please feel free to put any questions you have in the chat. We are recording this, but it's very important that you're here live, especially if you are looking for those CEU credits. So I'm really grateful that you're here with us. We do have a follow-up page for this program on our website called, which is the conversation.zone, specifically /addiction. And my colleague Bob Lamb is on as well, and he'll put that link and some others in the chat for you. And also if you're, don't worry about taking screenshots of any of Jessica's presentation, because you have her a PDF of her presentation available on that follow-up page. So thank you so much to Jessica for that. So if you are interested in the two continuing education credits hours, if you are a Pennsylvania psychologist, LCSW, LSW, LMFT, this is for you. You can also try submitting to the PCB if you have some of those peer support credentials. They often accept a lot of these trainings as well. Please complete the evaluation that will show up after this program. Bob is also going to share that link with you in the chat, especially as we get to the end of the program. Please wait until the program is completed to take that, to complete that form. We do ask that you complete it within 24 hours. The certificates will be sent within a 2-week period. And make sure you hang on to those CEUs, because there is an administrative fee for any additional certificates that might be needed. Thanks to the Phoenix Center for Experiential Trauma Therapy for helping us out with these continuing education credits. Please just know that we have a lot of resources on our website, conversation.zone. Just want to make sure that you're aware that we have so much to offer there. We have a YouTube channel that has quite a lot of content on it. So as you're working with individuals, especially who are seeking a deeper understanding of certain topics that we may have presented on, I think it could be really helpful to share some of these links. Please follow us on social media. And I want to just let you know about 2 services that we offer in addition to our community events that take place around the year. We kind of slow down with our programming. In this case, of course, we have this professional development program, but our community events tend to take place between September and May, June, roughly that area. But you can learn about our other services, such as our parent partnership meetings. We currently have 18, soon to be 19 meetings taking place weekly throughout the year. Many of them, and they can all be found on this section of our website, Parent Partnership. Many of them, as you see in purple, are in person. Those buttons you click on them, you get the details about where it is, who's in charge, who you can reach out to for some support. The green buttons are on Zoom, so those can be joined from anywhere geographically. We're excited that on September 6th, we're starting our first in-person parent partnership meeting that we've had for some time in Bucks County. That'll be in Doylestown starting September 6th. So very excited about that. We also have something called the Family Recovery Course. This is a 3-part course, peer-led. We are very happy to offer this at no charge to participants. We cap each course at 12 participants. It's led by 2 instructors who are peer support providers. So they've received a lot of training and background information. They're compensated. They're very committed and dedicated to serving these families. But it's been a really tremendous response to this. And so you can find details about the Family Recovery Course. Is this right for you? This is for parents and guardians predominantly. This is not something that is a continuing ed program. This is not for learning more about how to work with families. This is for the family in crisis. We want to save those spots for folks who are not necessarily in crisis, but looking for a better understanding of their own journey to recovery as a family member of someone impacted by a substance use disorder. So I'm going to introduce you now to Jessica Molavi. Jess began her career working with Miramont more than 12 years ago as a primary clinician, working directly with clients in the inpatient setting for the treatment of substance use disorder, mental health, and trauma. She received a specific certification as an advanced certified relapse prevention specialist in 2011, allowing her to focus attention to those patients struggling with chronic relapse syndrome and work with the staff to build a specific program to support the treatment of relapse. She currently oversees the effectiveness and functionality of the program and works to provide prevention-driven care for all patients under the Gorski model. She also completed a 42-hour trauma competency training and certification for EMDR, which stands for Eye Movement Desensitization Reprocessing, a specific approach to treatment of trauma, allowing her to support clients in addressing and processing their underlying core emotional issues while in the inpatient setting. She's currently the clinical manager of specialty services, working to ensure clinical excellence in the treatment of relapse, trauma, pain management, and in support of first responders, the LGBTQ population, and family systems. So thank you so much for being here, Jessica. Really happy to have you.
Thank you, Kim, and thank you so much for having me. Thanks, everyone, for coming today. I'm just going to share my screen. As Kim mentioned, my current role at Miramont Treatment Center's inpatient program is clinical manager of specialty services. We kind of have these sort of, subgroups within the population that we serve that really have separate cultural norms and require these specialized services. And that's my primary focus and attention currently right now. I, working as an inpatient clinician several years ago, really got very focused on the relapse population. I kept seeing the same patients come in, they'd get 6 months, do really well, pick up, come back, get 9 months, pick up, come back. And it didn't make a lot of sense to me that we were putting those people through the same treatment process with the same information and then expecting a different outcome. That sounded like the same insanity of addiction to me. So at the time, I was very blessed that our administration were huge fans of Terry Gorski. For those of you who are not familiar, he's kind of like the godfather of addiction in our clinical world. But he's really very famous for his work around relapse. He kind of changed the game in terms of how we understand it, how we see it as a separate diagnosis, and how do we effectively treat it so that we can reduce the risk that the population is going to fall into these constant patterns of self-sabotage and self-harm. So I took that training and then completed my certification and built the program at Miramont. And now I do my very best to offer this training as much as I possibly can so that everybody can kind of learn to see relapse from a different perspective and better understand how to treat it. I always like to, even though I know I'm preaching to the converted, and you all probably already know this, I think it's a good way to build into understanding relapse. I like to review substance use disorder as a disease. It is characterized that way under the AMA because of the mental obsession and preoccupation that drives compulsive behavior despite consequences. So what does that mean? An alcoholic gets a DUI and they immediately want to go home and drink. An addict that just died was Narcaned and revived and immediately wants to go get high. The consequences alone are never enough to produce an active change in the behavior because the disorder itself disrupts every aspect of the person's personality, belief systems, perceptions, reactions, judgment, decision-making, all of it. As someone then progresses from misusing or abusing a substance, as you know, denial becomes activated and they're no longer able to recognize the fact that their life is directly unmanageable as a result of the drug and alcohol use. And that, of course, leads to further progression. As we know, in order to best understand relapse, we have to understand what recovery looks like. I can't tell you how many times I do lecture and I'll ask the community how many people are here because of a relapse, and everybody raises their hand. And when I review what the criteria for a relapse is, over half of them change their mind. The reason that's important is not to discount previous efforts that people have made, because that's important. Their investment, their commitment, their knowledge, their insight is all valuable. But once a person starts to self-identify as a chronic relapser, it really creates a lot of ingrained mistaken beliefs that are potentially harmful to their outcomes. They can start to feel like something is wrong with them or different about them, that they can't seem to get the program like everybody else, and set themselves up for failure despite their motivation to change. So we really want to pull out and separate out how much of your history is authentic recovery, and how much of it is attempts, right? And really looking at where are they actually you regressing into a relapse, so we can help the person better understand. So what defines being in recovery? I think there's a component physically, mentally, and emotionally where you have to be stable before anything else. Treatment isn't going to effectively work unless you're medically stabilized first and foremost. And then your thought patterns and processes can start to stabilize in the inpatient setting, as well as your emotional ability to identify and manage feelings, intervene and cope in healthy and effective ways. The person will have had to fully accept and understand their diagnosis, in order to be considered in recovery. You can't have any aspects or levels of denial that are interfering with really treating the diagnosis. You have to have abstained from any and all mind, mood altering chemicals, not just your primary drug of choice. This is still a very common mistaken belief among patients where they'll say, I want to go in the relapse prevention group. I've had 5 years sober. And then when I sit down with them and start talking to them, they'll be like, well, I haven't used heroin in 5 years, but I've drank. So it's really important that we look at the abstinent piece first around their stability, and then have they actively engaged in a 12-step or recovery program of support, where they're attending meetings, working with some sort of peer or sponsor, going through the 12-step process, or if you're looking at refuge recovery, whatever the preferred choice is. Have they really demonstrated active, consistent change? Are they involved in commitments and service? Has there been a real shift in their mindset, their perception, their behaviors, their beliefs? That's what we're really considering a person to be in recovery looking like. And this has to have happened for a minimum of 6 months, for it to be considered full sustained remission. Once a person has established that, if they then return to alcohol and other drug use, it's considered a relapse. Anything prior to that is more of a lapse or a slip. And then looking at how we define relapse, a lot of people view it as the action of picking up the drink or the drug. But in reality, it's actually the process of becoming dysfunctional while you're in recovery, right? The very end result is that the person picks up the drink or the drug. But this is following a period of active sobriety where they have become symptomatic over the course of time and unable to recognize that there's a progression of warning signs occurring that should indicate, hey, red flag, I'm in a regression, I'm having problematic thinking, I'm having unhealthy behaviors. The relapse should become evident so that they're able to intervene and stop themselves from progressing further. But oftentimes what happens with this disease and this disorder is the person is not able to identify or recognize that those warning signs are happening. So just some overall facts about relapse, because there is so much research and information out there. This is what we know to be true. Facts are facts. Relapse is the biggest problem that's occurring among people with substance use disorder. There's still a very high rate and risk factor around relapse. Once a relapse occurs, progression happens in frequency, tolerance, amount, which then in turn creates worse consequences, more family disruption, more disruption within self and personality. The disease itself becomes more progressive in nature and makes it difficult to treat. So when someone's in treatment for the 5th time, you're not treating the same diagnosis you did when they were in treatment the first time, right? There are changes. Everything has grown. The symptoms have gotten worse. They've progressed. And ultimately, these self-defeating patterns have become further ingrained in the individual, which makes it harder for them to consciously recognize where they have to make necessary changes. Because of prior treatment experiences and failed efforts or attempts, the person can struggle often with a lot of motivation for treatment. They feel like, I've already done this, I've already learned this, you're not going to teach me anything I don't already know. And they immediately create barriers and resistance to getting out of the treatment process what they absolutely need to. Treating relapsers is my favorite, but they are without a doubt the savviest patients in the building because they are very treatment experienced. They could probably teach some of the lectures if we're being totally honest. They have all of this insight and knowledge, and vast experience, and they can quote the big book and what page it's on and the origin, but there is a major disconnect around their inability to use that information in their own life when it's absolutely needed, right? So we know that they can present very skillfully as if they are in recovery, but is there real active change happening? Are they really addressing, the primary issues? Because they're such skilled survivors, they can appear as if they're the mayor of Miramont, Mr. Recovery. Everybody knows who they are, loves them. They're, super vested and motivated, but the whole time they tend to skate over, under, and around the biggest issues that are keeping them sick. They're not doing that consciously or intentionally or in a deviant way, but they've become so innate at being able to skate around discomfort that it becomes tricky if you're not skilled at really identifying and addressing that. They know how to get around it or avoid it, right? So once a relapse occurs, you're going to be dealing with all these additional barriers, and it can make it difficult and create added resistance for the person's ability to engage and change. The biggest thing to note is that relapse is always going to begin before the addictive use happens. It is a progression of warning signs that create risk. And those warning signs are going to exist within thought impairment. That's one of the first things that's going to occur, where suddenly they're not processing information the same way they would normally. Everyday kind of average problems become very difficult for them to solve. They're going to then experience some emotional disruption and have either an overreactivity to things, or on the flip end, become very disconnected and numb. So they will end up snapping and getting reactive to the people they care about the most without even recognizing that they have very low patience and tolerance and are functioning at a higher level of frustration and agitation. As a result of that, their stress level goes up significantly, which ultimately will start to impair them. People don't really recognize how much stress affects us. It will literally impair you. And then that leads to an increase in impulsivity, because now I'm uncomfortable, and I'm going to start making poor decisions and acting without really thinking things through. Ultimately, that leads to an even higher level of discomfort, which creates a desire for addictive behavior. Addictive behavior produces instant gratification and relief, right? It's attractive. It hooks people. If it wasn't, we'd be out of business by now. But that tendency to be like, okay, well, I'm still sober, so I can't get high, but I can get creative in other ways with my behavior to try to find relief. At this stage in the game, people will start to experience more serious issues, more high-risk concerns around memory impairment and actual physical issues like sleep disruption, chronic headaches, migraines, physical pain. When you're not dealing with the mental, emotional disruption of progression, it starts to manifest physically. And then that in turn will create a disruption in the person's life routine and recovery routine. So now things like self-care go out the window. Things that you're doing for joy and fulfillment are not as important. Reading your big book at night, your prayer and meditation, all of that starts to go out the window and fall by the wayside. And once that occurs, people tend to then disconnect from healthy peers and relationships because they know that they're at risk to be found out. And it's really hard to stay sick around people who are healthy. So this is the place and time in that progression where people will pull away from their program of support, and their perception will shift, and they'll start to find reasons why they no longer need to attend meetings, why the people there are not helping them, and why it's not beneficial for them. Once that piece occurs and they disconnect from their program, they've now hit a point in the progression where they've lost total control. So under Gorski's philosophy, he believes that as you're going through this entire progression, you are not able to recognize you're in it until you've lost total control. And when you're at that place in the progression, the likelihood that you're going to ask for help is less than 1%. So when you're in the liquor store parking lot or on your way to COP, you're not going to call your sponsor, right? You are just as symptomatic as if you've already put the substance in your body. You are very impaired. You've pushed everybody away and you've shut down in a way that you can't recognize you're spiraling. So no one at this place in the progression is going to reach out for help. It's just extremely unlikely. And you could see how majority of treatment providers take the approach of people, places, and things. But under this philosophy for relapsers, by the time they're in people, places, and things, it's already too late. We can't do a prevention strategy that's centered around a person being so high risk, they're not able to stop themselves. At that point, they've made up their mind and they don't want anyone talking them out of the decision. We have to look way earlier in the process when they're still motivated and willing to do something about it. But as they're going through this progression, they are creating such significantly high levels of stress and discomfort that they become more and more desperate for relief. And the further they get into that, the more the mistaken beliefs become activated that the substance is what's going to give them that relief. Because as human beings, innately, we want to avoid pain. We don't want to feel discomfort, and we will go to great lengths to avoid it, whether we're in addiction or not. And at this point in the progression with addicts and alcoholics getting ready to relapse, they really start to believe at this point, I have no other choice but to pick up or hurt myself. And in some way, using actually prevents that, because as soon as they pick up the drink or the drug, it's going to actually stabilize them for a moment. Because if you're thinking about how impaired they're becoming through the progression, they're very symptomatic by the end. When they pick up that substance, it's going to be like the best deep breath they ever took, and create this belief that this is what I've been missing the entire time. I'm really much more functional when I can use. And then, of course, we know that doesn't last, and they end up in a cycle of chaos and unmanageability. But their thinking, behaviors, and beliefs are already so impaired that it's just as if they've already used. So again, we cannot wait until we're at that high risk situation. This is, under the Gorski model, what the relapse progression tends to look like across the board. It's, of course, individualized to the person based on their underlying core issues, their unresolved traumas, their particular behaviors and compulsions of choice. But in general, based on his research, these are the most common warning signs that take people from a place of, I'm really invested in recovery and it's all I want in my life, to, I think I can have one drink. If you think about that shift, right? The program hasn't changed. It's been the way it has since the day it was created. So if a person goes from, this is my whole life, to, I can't stand these people, what did change is them, right? Their perception has shifted in some way. Gorski's belief really is that stress is one of the biggest triggers or risk factors for a relapse progression to occur. Under his research, he's really shown that addicts and alcoholics, but particularly relapsers, do not respond to stress the same way your average person does. They either have an incredibly low tolerance level for stress, meaning as soon as they feel discomfort, they revert right into what they know how to do to feel better, or they have such a high tolerance for stress that they don't even know stress is happening until they've totally imploded. So when stress happens for them, it's normally a direct result of some sort of change. Change is a natural part of life that we are not going to be able to prevent or avoid. Change can be positive, it can be negative, it can be internal, external, a new relationship, a loss of a job. Change reminds them that they're out of control and that they're powerless, which immediately activates a stress response. When that stress response becomes activated for a relapser, they respond with their innate wiring of denial, right? I'm good. I got this. I'm okay. People with this diagnosis are the most skilled on the planet at presenting as if everything is fantastic, when internally they could be completely self-destructing. So they immediately, instead of recognizing that their stress level is elevating, go into denial of it and act as if they're fine, which ultimately elevates their stress level even higher and puts them in something called post-acute withdrawal syndrome. This is different than post-acute withdrawal symptoms, which happens post-detox, a couple of days of discomfort. This is an actual syndrome that results in staying in a chronic period of stress for too long and creates that thought impairment, emotional disruption, behavior change, like we talked about earlier. Once that happens, the desire to act out becomes so severe because of that need for relief. And people will start subtly pushing the boundaries, pushing the limits. It might be like, oh, I'm going to steal this Snickers at the Wawa, even though I have a 20 in my pocket, just because I can. There's always this desire at this point to feel something outside of themselves. I want to be anywhere other than in my own body. So I'm going to find little creative ways to get a hit. And once that happens, it becomes very hard to stay engaged in a program because people are going to start to hold you accountable and call you out on what you're doing. And for somebody at this stage in the game, they're not going to want to hear that. They're going to become defensive and reactive and push back, which is then where they pull away from the program of choice and start to break down that life structure. And that is, of course, then in turn when total loss of control and judgment kick in, and they feel like they have no other choice but to pick up. So this is kind of your common cycle that people get themselves into. And the idea would be we have to look early in the process around change and stress and denial as our primary prevention factors, because the further they get into the progression, the less likely they become in their capability of intervening. I can't tell you how many people, when I ask, why'd you relapse? What happened? The most common answer that I always get, I stopped working a program. But nobody ever asks why. And why you stopped working the program has way more significance than the fact that you stopped. Because once you're gone from the program, you're already in that high risk situation. We need to figure out what is the driver that takes you from a place where you're vested in this to not so much, right? The post-acute withdrawal syndrome is basically Gorski's way of, terming what a dry drunk would be. That you're not actively drinking and using, but you're staying symptomatic in a lot of other aspects of your life. You don't have the ability to identify or connect the fact that you are in discomfort and why you're in discomfort. This can happen to people up to multiple years in recovery and abstinence. And normally they're not able to realize what's going on. They just know that they feel extremely uncomfortable. They can't make sense of it, and they oftentimes will not ask for help because they're in long-term remission and feel like they should just be able to figure it out. The tendency then would be to ignore signs and symptoms of stress, which make it worse over the course of time, and then cause all the other symptoms that we talked about, where suddenly now things that wouldn't normally bother you are making you extremely angry and agitated. And causing you to lose that patience and tolerance, which then in turn leads to a lot of mistakes. Post-acute withdrawal, like we said, will become active as a result of staying in that stress response. And once it becomes active, that is the place in the progression that it becomes more severe and more high risk. And the person will then start to do what we call reenact subconscious automatic patterns that keep them wired for self-sabotage and self-harm. They have these patterns already innately ingrained within them, even if they've done work in the past. Once they stop doing that work, the patterns can reemerge. And when they get into a relapse progression, they become activated. And their instinct and wiring will become that desired outcome of sabotage without them consciously recognizing that they're even doing it. So your warning signs at this point are going to go from early stage critical to very high risk and severe. And because they can't see it, then they're allowing themselves to progress further and further into it. Really important to look at the stress response when you're talking about relapse syndrome or relapse diagnosis, because as we talked about, they don't react and respond to it. The reason behind that, substance abuse in general, right, is wiring for the instant gratification and relief. The more someone becomes dependent and reliant on a quick fix or something that's incredibly powerful for numbing and avoiding, the less capable they become of tolerating discomfort and basic stress. And it can be really hard for them to sit with that in everyday life. That coupled with the fact that they're living in a lot of chaos, unmanageability, and crisis every single day, which they adapt to. It becomes kind of a norm for them, especially if they have a history of trauma or attachment to some underlying unresolved issue that allows them to latch on to hurting themselves. So they have a real skill set for detaching from all those uncomfortable feelings and emotions until they can't anymore. And they'll act as if they have it all together. They'll present this lifestyle that everything is wonderful and not be open about the fact that they're really starting to self-destruct internally. And nobody would know because they're that skilled. Normally, family starts to pick up on it before the person does, but it takes a long time. They're actually in that place for a significant period. There is something that Gorski talks about called a stuck point. A stuck point is something that all of us have in recovery, and they are things that we absolutely need to change if we're going to be successful, but we struggle to change, right? And there are reasons for that. Number one, we are either in denial of the fact that it's a problem. We are resistant to it. So that would be like, yeah, I hear you that I need to get out of this relationship. I agree with you, but I'm not going to do it. And fear, because people have been doing things the way they've been doing it for so long, and it works for them and it helps soothe them, that they are terrified to do anything different. They're also scared that if I really put in effort and I really try and I fail, that's going to hurt me 10 times worse. So I would rather take control of the sabotage and, make my own destiny or outcome, which sounds insane, but that's what happens around their comfort levels. That high versus low tolerance and that logic versus emotion is what activates defense mechanisms. So this is the best way that I teach this. Up here, we have our frontal lobe. This is where all of our logic, our reasoning, our rational decision making is, right here. Very important. Back here is our amygdala. That is where all of our survival skills, our defense mechanisms, and our instincts are. When those two parts of the brain are online at the same time, we are very high functioning because we're making decisions with both logic and emotion. And what happens under Gorski's model and belief is that as our stress level starts to elevate, as soon as we experience that as threatening, our frontal lobe will completely shut down and our amygdala will go crazy. He literally shows this in a brain scan. So whether someone is, threatening your life, or a therapist is poking at you to talk about core issues that you don't want to deal with, the brain doesn't know the difference. It only knows, I don't like this. This is making me uncomfortable. I feel like this is a threat in some way. I don't want to deal with these issues. I'm going to flip into what I know how to do to stay safe, which are our wired primary defense mechanisms. It's like when you're watching the scary movie and you're like, this dumb chick is running up the steps when the front door is right there and it seems ridiculous. She doesn't have logic on board. If she did, she'd be like, oh, there's a window. I could get my car keys. I could go. She'd be dead by then. She just knows someone's trying to hurt me, run. And it's the same thing when you're dealing with unresolved emotional issues, especially for somebody who's wired to avoid stress. They will automatically, subconsciously do what they know how to do to survive. The primary ways that they do that are through compliance, which is, I'm just going to feed this therapist whatever she wants to hear, so she backs off. And they know exactly what to say and how to present it. They will take flight, which is your AMAs, right? Against medical advice. I can't be here. I can't do treatment. I got to go. It's always something bigger than that. And then, of course, fighting or getting aggressive and defensive basically teaches people, don't ever hit that nerve again. I'm not going to talk about it. And then numbing out and just completely disconnecting, which is more of your trauma response and denial. These are what will get activated when someone is in a state of stress that they can no longer tolerate. So when those stuck points become activated, it will immediately elevate the person's stress level, which will then cause them to go into those primary defense mechanisms and lead into those levels of resistance. So it can be really hard for the person, especially because it's wiring, it's innate, and they're not consciously aware of it. So even though you and I and family are recognizing you're doing it right now, you're in a stuck point right now, you're reacting in a way that's harmful to your outcomes. They can't see it and they definitely can't hear it. So that's what makes it very hard to challenge and address them within a treatment process, because you're dealing with somebody who is offline. You're dealing with somebody who does not have logic on board in that exact moment. The idea would be that we need to get them to identify and understand what their common stuck points are and how that contributes to their history of relapse. It's really hard to prevent a relapse if you don't know why it happened in the first place, or if you have a misperception of why it occurred. And it's really difficult to intervene in a relapse progression if you don't know you're in it. So a primary goal would really be awareness, right? The therapist has to work with the client on what are these stuck points, understand where they come from and why it's a problem, and look at, is there any room for change, right? So a stuck point of mine, let's say, would be, I don't trust people. And that comes from a very significant history of trauma and abandonment, right? Rightly so. So let's say I'm sitting with that stuck point in my recovery process. If I do not work on that and address that, as soon as I go into the rooms of AA, I'm going to be put in a position where I have to trust others, which is going to activate my stuck point, elevate my stress, and cause me to do what I know how to do to survive, which is I'm just going to pretend everything is great and not really speak up honestly about what's going on. So you could see how resistance to changing stuck points would be a natural part of relapse prevention. Engagement in the work can sometimes be difficult because we're basically getting in the way of everything they use to stay safe. And that's very difficult. Just because it's unhealthy and negative and hurts them doesn't mean it doesn't meet a need, serve a purpose, and make them feel in control and safe. So it's a very delicate balance around, we're not going to take away everything you use to feel better, but we do want to highlight where there are areas of concern and look at what it is you are trying to avoid and address that in a healthy and effective way to reduce the risk that you're going to revert into these patterns. So what even is a warning sign, right? It's very different than a trigger. A trigger is something that activates the desire to use or drink, right? Like you bumped into an old dealer at a Wawa, or you saw a drinking commercial and it made you want to drink. Warning signs are ingrained in who you are. It's any aspect of the person's lifestyle or personality that take them from a stable place in recovery back to risk for active addiction. They are usually connected to the person's beliefs and perceptions, thought patterns, emotions, coping skills, behaviors, patterns of self-sabotage, and relationship issues. They always lead to what we say is unnecessary pain and discomfort, which increase the risk of problems, which increase the risk for bad decisions. Ultimately, the pain and problems are deemed unnecessary because the person is actually causing it for themselves, but they just can't realize that they're doing that. So this creates the risk for the relapse progression and it makes it more severe. So important to really understand kind of what a warning sign is if you're going to effectively take them through the process. This is the philosophy behind what the warning signs are based on under Gorski's beliefs. So we have our personality, right, which develops before we're even 9 years old. How does that happen? How do we learn that we can't trust other people? We don't like pizza. We prefer men over women, right? How do we know that? All of that happens as a result of genetics and environment, the way we're taught to feel about ourselves, think about ourselves, the way our needs were met. Anything that we grew up with is going to shape and mold a lot of who we are. Now, personality can be disrupted at any point in life by crisis and trauma and dysfunction at any point in life. Once that disruption occurs, it impacts everything. Our personality is what shapes our belief system, right? And our belief system is our core truth. My beliefs may differ from Kim's, may differ from Bob's, but that doesn't mean mine are right and hers are wrong. Our beliefs are our core truth. It's what we know and lock into and believe as our reality. Our belief system controls our perception, which is how we see ourselves, other people, and the world around us, right? Our perception then activates a series of automatic thoughts, which then trigger feelings, which then lead to urges, which then lead to behaviors. And then our behavior in turn will cause a reaction from other people. So an example of this would be if I have had an experience of being let down, disappointed, and hurt since the time I'm 6 years old, that's going to be an ingrained belief, right? So my belief is people have hurt me and therefore they will always hurt me, which drives a perception that the world is not a safe place. I can't talk, I can't trust, I can't feel, is then going to be the thoughts that are happening as a result of those beliefs and perceptions. I can't trust other people is going to activate feelings that are uncomfortable, anger, shame, frustration, sadness. Those emotions are going to kickstart urges that are very self-defeating. I really want to get high. I want to shut down. I want to act out. The action could either be that you do just that, or you could really want to get high and actually just isolate and shut everybody out, which then in turn people will respond to by either arguing or avoiding. This is the process that happens in one warning sign, right? So in one warning sign, we have this series of events that then triggers the next and the next and the next. I always use this example. Let's say, growing up, I'm really attached to dad and he leaves. And then, several years later, my mom gets in a relationship with a new guy and I get very attached to this fellow and then he leaves. And then I grow up and I get in my first relationship, super attached, he leaves. At some point, my reality is going to be everybody always leaves me, abandonment, because that's what the reality has been. And then I get in my first healthy relationship and the person doesn't go anywhere. That is then going to feel extremely uncomfortable for me because it doesn't match the belief system that's in my head. It doesn't match my core truth and reality. So I will start to subconsciously push. I love you. I hate you. I want you. I don't. Come here. Just kidding. Get away, until the person can't take it anymore and they leave. And then I'm like, see, everybody always leaves me. When in reality, I created this subconscious sabotage, this self-fulfilling prophecy, because of the belief system. It drove the outcomes. This is what segues us up into what relapse syndrome is. Relapse syndrome is really a separate diagnosis from substance use disorder. That's the way it should be seen. And it can really occur once a person goes through one or more relapses. But basically what it means is the person no longer has the conscious ability to recognize that they are in a progression until they've lost that control. Other people in recovery and addiction can see it. Someone with relapse syndrome cannot. Denial will get activated and they can't recognize that there's a problem until they've already lost control and they're just as sick as if they've used the substance, like we talked about earlier. The lack of awareness to their specific warning signs are what drive them into the relapse. Okay? So oftentimes they can only identify what they believe triggered a relapse, which usually it started way prior to that. They can see what happened on a surface level. I stopped going to meetings. I started hanging out with the wrong people. I stopped doing the things that were keeping me well. What they can't see are the drivers to those decision makings. And that wired subconscious automatic patterns is what creates difficulty for that outcome of self-harm and makes it very hard for the person to intervene on those patterns. Normally, the person with relapse syndrome is going to have one or more unresolved underlying issues that are connected to emotional trauma, self-worth, trust issues, fear, shame, and lack of control. Those are the biggest common themes that I see across the board that are always connected back. Whether it looks different for 5 people, it's always related to some unresolved emotional trauma. Issues around self-worth lead to self-sabotage. Not being able to trust creates a disconnect from the program, so on and so forth, right? So when we're dealing with somebody who has relapse syndrome, we're really looking at specific criteria. It can become difficult to treat somebody with relapse syndrome because they've had those multiple treatment experiences and they're very savvy around treatment norms and expectations. They're those highly skilled survivors that know how to skate around. They have all these mistaken beliefs that they know what's best for them, and they have all this resistance around what's needed to get well. So I'll see all the time, they'll be like, Jess, I swear to God, this time I'm willing to do whatever it takes. Just tell me what to do to get sober and I will do it. And I'm like, okay, we need to go to long-term treatment. And they're like, accept that. That's like the one thing I can't do. So they're already creating resistance and conditions on what's needed to get well, increasing risk immediately, right? So because of the prior treatment experiences, they believe that they need less care when in reality, they actually need more care. And this is the only illness they're going to be resistant to taking the necessary medicine to get well, right? Any other illness, you're going to listen, take direction, do what you have to do. But ultimately, what is going to trigger relapse syndrome? One of the biggest reasons is, like we said, chronic stress and underlying emotional issues. These patients struggle to identify when stress is occurring, and they need help to recognize what early signs of stress look like. They don't know that they're in it, remember, till it's too late. So the only way we're going to reduce this automatic response of going into those primary defense mechanisms is by teaching them what stress looks like for them, and then teaching them how to get healthy forms of relief to bring themselves back down. One of the ways we do this in the Gorski model is through something called a stress thermometer. When a patient's stress is elevating during the clinical work, we as therapists help the patient to recognize this. And then we pause and teach them, this is a moment where you would inevitably revert into your defense mechanisms. Let's help you not do what you always do. Let's take a breath. Let's figure out what about this just triggered you. Let's talk about that, and let's teach you how to change your wired, reaction to it so that your outcome can be much better, right? There are little tells that they teach you in the Gorski training that patients have around body language, shift in eye contact, things that would basically tell you just touched on something significant. This work is designed to trigger up stress and warning signs, not in a way that you want to make the patient uncomfortable, but in a way that we want to teach them to recognize when they're doing it right there in the moment, because that's going to bring on the most awareness possible and help them with intervention and prevention skills. As human beings, we have to get relief. If we don't, we will not survive. So if they're not getting relief in the healthy ways, what are they going to do? Inevitably, they're going to go to the unhealthy ways. So the stress thermometer goes from 0 to 14. 0 to 3 is kind of like, the least level of stress you can have, where you're kind of barely engaged in your day, just waking up, haven't really been exposed to much yet. 3 to 6 is what we call healthy, high functioning stress, where kind of like right now, right? We're talking, we're engaged, we're listening, we're active. We don't have to work very hard to put in effort. What we teach them to watch out for is a level 7. This is where the brain starts to become overwhelmed with what's happening and begins to shut down. So what that looks like normally is when someone starts to go back into their head or leaves the room and they don't realize it until they come back. Probably done it 100 times since I've been talking. It's just a natural part of what happens when we're elevating in stress. Our brain starts to do for us what we're not doing for ourselves, which is acknowledge, right? And so when they hit that 7, if they don't pause and come back down to a healthy level of functional stress, they'll go into those primary defenses of compliance and fight and freeze, which then they'll stay in for a longer period of time, which leads to levels 9 through 12, which is really where that impairment in thinking, emotion, and behavior kick in. If a person stays in that phase for too long, they go into more of a psychiatric trauma level response that happens 12 to 14. A lot of people who have no history of mental health or co-occurring issues or suicidal thinking with relapse issues will say that they started to want to take their own life. And it wasn't because they really wanted to die. It was because they wanted to feel better. They wanted to feel anything differently than what they were in. And so the options in their mind were either hurt myself or pick up. That's the severity of what stress can really do. So based on this whole kind of core philosophy and approach, Gorski developed several approaches for patients who are in various stages of change. The first one being denial management, which is really where you're dealing with a patient who does not have the ability to understand or accept the diagnosis and their need for change. There are certain stages of denial, and he developed specific intervention tools to address that denial based on where the patient is at. Then there is relapse prevention counseling, which is for the patient who has a history of continuous lapsing, multiple treatment experiences, and can never really sustain more than a couple months of sobriety at a time. So they'll do 90 days, they'll do 60 days, they'll do some meetings, maybe get a sponsor, but they never wholeheartedly fully commit to a program. They're just kind of in and out, in and out. The relapse prevention counseling is very much centered around warning sign identification for those patients and really figuring out what the disconnect is. And then there's advanced relapse prevention therapy, which is what we're talking about now, where the patient has sustained a history of real sobriety, 6 months or longer, active, and gone into those progressions and really requires help around treating the relapse syndrome. When we meet a patient who we believe should go into the group or they themselves are advocating, we do an interview. The reason behind that is the work is specifically designed for people who meet the criteria for relapse syndrome. If I put somebody in that program with a unique modality that's specialized around relapse syndrome and they don't have relapse syndrome, the work is not going to make sense. And it in turn is actually probably going to hurt them because they're not prepared to engage in it the way somebody with the criteria would be. So the criteria in the interview is basically based around really discerning, is this somebody who had active remission or not? And then once we discern that they do, they can engage in the advanced relapse prevention therapy process, which is basically a combination of psychoeducation, right? I need to gain insight and understanding into what relapse syndrome is. A lot of people have never even heard that term before, especially patients. And that in and of itself brings immense relief. It's like the first time someone tells you you're an alcoholic, they just make sense of it for you. When someone explains that you have relapse syndrome and they make sense of it for you, people start to really feel, oh my God, this makes so much sense. This is why I am the way I am. This is why this continues to happen. And I really now have some instilled hope that if I understand what it is, I can effectively treat it. Stress identification and management are a huge component of the work. It's pretty much everything we do at every level, teaching them, what does stress look like? Where did it come from? And what do I do with it? It's crucial to onboard those skills if they're going to be successful. We use something called the Advanced Prevention Therapy Workbook, which I'll talk about. It's a series of exercises that's basically designed to help them with warning sign identification and warning sign management. Another huge piece of the work is peer-to-peer connection and accountability. They need the relatability of the shared common lived experience of chronic cycles of relapse to really help produce an empowerment for change. It's a really helpful part of the process when they can give back, just like you would with sponsoring other people. Gorski actually recommends that somebody get an RPT sponsor in addition to their AA or NA sponsor so that they can really focus on this specific work. Obviously, relapse intervention and prevention skills are going to be a must. Family involvement is huge because somebody with relapse syndrome is going to be dealing with the highest level of discord in their relationships and family dynamics. So that all has to get addressed if we want them to have the best possible outcomes. And then aftercare planning. Aftercare planning is the hardest with people with relapse syndrome because they're treatment saturated. They've done it for so long, for so many years, in and out. They don't want to spend any more of their time doing long-term treatment. The catch-22 is if you would just do the year-long, commitment right away for the long-term outcomes, you could prevent being in and out for the next 5 years. But unfortunately, a lot of people have to learn the hard way. This advanced relapse prevention workbook, like I said, is a series of 14 exercises. The first exercise is all the stress management stuff, introducing the thermometer, talking about why stress significantly impairs them, why they're different in their response to stress, and how to learn the different varying levels and what that looks like for them. We use a lot of holistic approaches in terms of the coping skills. So we'll do deep breathing, mindfulness, mindful walking, anything we can implement in the moment to decrease stress is usually centered around holistics. The second exercise, which is actually the first pen to paper exercise that they do, is geared towards learning from past efforts of recovery. So each exercise is designed to pull up a different set of warning signs. And exercise 2 is about their program of recovery. What did they do well? What did they not do so well? Where are their barriers? Where are their resistance? Maybe they really struggle to be honest with their sponsor. They always have a hard time when they hit step 4. Whatever their patterns are related to their program is going to come out in exercise 2. Exercise 3 is something called the life and use history, which is the most intense exercise in the book. It is going to start in early childhood and go all the way into adulthood and really look at those underlying unresolved emotional core issues and traumas. We do not do this in a way that it actively creates harm or risk for them to shut down. We are very big on really assessing who's appropriate and has the skill set to engage so that we know that they're capable of stopping if it becomes too much for them and have onboarded skills to decompress. Exercise 4 is a relapse recovery calendar that's going to look at patterns. Is there a time of year? Is there an anniversary? Is there a season? Is there any theme around, time frames with going in and coming back out? And then exercise 5 is a review of the 15 biggest warning signs that take people out, where they will self-identify and relate based on their own experiences. So after a patient engages in an exercise, they answer the questions as honestly as they can. You really can't get it wrong. Then what we do is we sit down with the patient, we do a review of the content of that exercise, and we work together to highlight warning signs. Every single time we find a warning sign, we make a warning sign identification card, which I normally just use index cards. Every single card starts with the phrase, "I know I'm in trouble with my recovery when I." So that basically you're wiring the brain to recognize what the warning sign is and associate it with the fact that when it happens, you're in trouble. Then you would put a title attached to each warning sign card, something that's like 1 to 5 words that kind of sums up what you're saying. So an example would be, "I know I'm in trouble with my recovery when I start to make excuses as to why I can't go to a meeting tonight." And then your title would be like "My Way" or "Justification." As long as it's in their language and it makes sense to them, it's right. The warning signs are really about awareness. That is the primary goal. It's not stop these warning signs. That would be like, "Stop doing heroin, it's bad for you." And they're like, okay, they can't, right? It's wiring. It's the same thing with this. The warning signs are not going to go away right away. They're wired for them. They are ingrained. They probably do them 50 times a day. It's more, can you see it? Can you recognize when you're in it? And can you stop yourself from going into the next one? That's the primary goal. After they've completed all 5 exercises, exercise 6, which is the primary treatment goal, would be then where, okay, now we have a fat stack of warning sign cards. Thanks for showing me how sick I am in these index cards, right? They can't really make sense of that full pile of cards. So the goal then would be sit down with the patient and figure out the exact order in which those cards happen. So we're going to get rid of ones that don't make sense. We're going to take out triggers. We're going to put duplicates together. And in the end, they're going to have no less than 5, no more than 15 primary warning signs that basically tell them what takes them from a place where they're super invested in recovery back to their first active use. And it's going to be very individualized and very specific to their primary history and all the work that they've done up to this point. And those warning signs are going to demonstrate early potential risk factors for progression, which are the underlying issues, the critical stage in the progression of warning signs and the high risk stage of warning signs. And once we have their progression laid out and we know exactly what happens to them, we pinpoint early in the first 5 cards what we call their 3 critical warning signs. And these are the 3 cards that if we removed them from the progression, the rest of it would not happen. None of it would occur. And so basically those 3 critical warning signs become the entire focus of the second half of the book, which is intervention and prevention skills. Because if we can catch it at that point in the progression early enough in when they're still motivated, capable, and willing to do something about it, then we can hopefully prevent the rest of it from even occurring. That's the goal, is now I have a concrete, tangible progression that helps me understand how I set myself up, that I not only can use for my own awareness, but I can share with other people, my sponsor, my therapist, really understanding this is what I do, help me not do this, and pinpoint those critical warning signs, which really become the primary focus of why they self-sabotage. And I will tell you across the board, those 3 critical warning signs are always attached to underlying traumas and core issues, always. The patient basically has to self-pick because they need to be things that they're ready and willing to address and that they're motivated to work on, because we're going to build the entire prevention plan around it. The goal, again, is not for them to stop. Okay, now I know what I do. I'm not going to do it anymore. No, awareness is not enough, right? We have to build in the ability to recognize so that they can then onboard, okay, I'm in my warning sign. What do I do with it? Once we have those 3 critical warning signs, they can then finish the remainder of the book. Exercise 7 is going to really break down what those warning signs are, and now also start to look at what happens to them when they're in the warning sign. What kind of thoughts are happening? What kind of feelings are arising? What kind of urges kick up? What kind of behaviors? We're really going to break it down and get super specific into their patterns. And then exercises 8 through 12 is going to tackle each aspect of that. 8 is really going to look at, okay, let's hone in on these unhealthy thinking patterns that kick up for you. Let's look at how we can change them into positive command statements. Exercise 9 is going to address the common themes among negative, uncomfortable emotions and look at what coping skills are you going to use for this. And I'm like, don't put down, I'm going to meditate for 40 minutes if you hate meditation, right? We need to figure out what works for you, what you're actually motivated to do that you know you can apply that will help you. 10 is really about impulse management and controlling reactions and decisions. 11 is about behavior, looking at common themes and patterns. And I will say 89% of people with chronic relapse syndrome normally have some co-occurring compulsive behavior that hasn't been addressed or treated simultaneously as the primary substance use disorder. And that oftentimes is a huge component of why they continue to relapse, whether it be mental health, gambling, sex and love addiction, whatever it is. They oftentimes miss that a lot. And this particular work can help highlight that. And then exercise 12 is all about reactions. Instead of inviting people into the problem, how do I invite them into the solution? But basically, exercise 7 through 12 are going to be then complete around the critical warning signs. And 13 and 14 are really going to be looking at how are you going to use this in your everyday life. Gorski really believes if you wake up every day and you read those 3 critical warning signs, you're going to go into your day with enough awareness that if they happen, you will see them. And then at night, you do a mini 10th step or self-inventory. Did I hit any of these warning signs today? And if I did, what should I do differently tomorrow? Gorski does have something called official warning sign cards that basically have the title, description, and breakdown of all the thoughts, feelings, urges, actions. The first side being the negative response, on the back side being what we want to change it into, which is the positive response. So in the end, they will have a much better understanding of what their underlying core drivers are and why they need to continue to work on them on a daily basis in an ongoing recovery. They will have recognition of what their primary critical warning signs are. And that's when we can start to really work on intervention and prevention skills. So intervention skills are going to be more, I'm in it right now. It's happening in the moment. What is a skill that I can use to try to challenge myself from going into my next warning sign and not getting into a worse part of relapse progression? So an example, right? I know I'm in trouble with my recovery when I start to feel overwhelmed by life stressors. An intervention skill, something effective of that would be to pause, make a priority list, see where I can delegate out, see where I'm taking on too much, set some healthy boundaries, right? Something that they're motivated to do to help pull them back out of those patterns that they get themselves into. The intervention skills should always be very specific to the person's warning signs, and they need to be integrated into their treatment process so that they can start to apply them in everyday active recovery and really see that they effectively work. And then there's prevention skills. Prevention skills are things that we're going to encourage them to do every single day to reduce the risk that they're even going to get into the warning signs, right? We want them to practice this overall ingrained routine that involves prevention skills that are specific to their plan of recovery. So you're going to have things that are basic, like your meeting attendance, your sponsorship, your home group, your relationships. But what is a daily plan of action to challenge or change the risk factor that you're going to get into those warning signs, right? So an example would be, I know I'm in trouble with my recovery when I feel as though I'm not good enough, right? What would be a daily strategy for prevention there? Setting small attainable goals, things that I can work towards, positive self-affirmations. It sounds very basic, and that's because it is, right? But you're just really honing in on the individualized, specific person and what their primary issues and warning signs are, and not waiting until it's too late, right? Examples would be things like daily inventory and reflection. Aftercare, like I said, is crucial. I'm always going to recommend, if it's somebody with relapse syndrome, that they remain engaged in long-term treatment. Whatever that looks like, I'm going to want them in a continuum of care for at least a year. that is going to significantly decrease the risk that they're going to revert back into these patterns, because the biggest mistake they make is, okay, now I know this work was fantastic. Now I know exactly what it is that I do. I know why I do this. That's the answer they all want when they come into the group, is why do I keep doing this? They don't want to keep using and getting high. They really don't. But they keep doing it anyway, and they really want to understand. And sometimes once they do, they think that's the solution, that's the answer, and now I'm not going to do it. But if that were true, nobody would relapse in the first place, right? Because you would always go to meetings and get a sponsor and do what you initially were told to do. So aftercare is really about taking those skills that have been learned, that awareness, that recognition, and helping rewire the person where they are not capable themselves. The insight is not effective alone for motivation of change. There has to be action steps. They really require additional structure, accountability, peer relationship support, application of recovery skills. So I'm always going to suggest you stay in that high continuum and slowly transition over the course of time. That is what's going to minimize risk and increase outcomes. That's always what we're looking at here, is what's going to minimize the risk and increase the outcome. Trauma and relapse are obviously highly connected. I think the statistics are about 96% of people with relapse issues also have some sort of underlying emotional trauma. There's a huge common thread between the two for all, if not all, most of the patients that come into the relapse group. So we're also going to be engaging them in trauma-informed and trauma-focused services at the very same time they're working on the relapse issues. I'm always very careful with this because I don't want to send a message that trauma is the reason they're an addict alcoholic or the reason that they relapse, right? Trauma impacts their personality. It impacts their belief system, their behaviors. All of that is what creates barriers and their ability to effectively, actively recover successfully, right? That trauma or unresolved issue is what's getting in the way of them getting their needs met effectively in a program, which then in turn leads to the cycle of relapse. The underlying trauma is normally what drives the progression patterns and the warning signs, but it's not a direct cause. So we try to help really educate and pull that out for them so that they understand the importance of treating it, but they don't latch onto it as an opportunity to justify self-sabotage over and over again. But the trauma, the risk factor there is that it's going to be what creates the reenactment patterns. When we don't deal with our underlying unresolved issues, we will inevitably reenact automatic patterns despite our commitment, despite our work in every area of our life. RPT is not a magic fix, right? So there's a lot of additional lifelong work that needs to take place and needs to happen. They really need to prioritize therapy and continued work on a trauma level in addition to their recovery to have the best possible outcomes. If they follow every recommendation that we give, every recommendation, they can increase their outcomes by 87% is the Gorski model effectiveness rate, which means 5 years or longer. And even if relapse does occur, because that happens, people engage in the work and they come back, the span that they're out is usually much shorter. The intensity goes down, their ability to intervene is quicker, and their ability to access care happens more efficiently. So relapse syndrome is something that's potentially going to cause continuous lapses and relapses. But however, it's still a success if they're capable of intervening before things become so significantly severe that now there's additional progression. So that's something that I try to help them understand, because the more people go through relapse, the more terrible they feel about themselves. They have probably the most shame out of everybody in the building and really believe something is broken within them or wrong with them, that they just cannot seem to get this right. And those beliefs, no matter, you could have the best quality treatment in the world, $80,000 luxury-based, excellent clinical care. You could do all that. But if you don't change your belief system, your perception will not change, and therefore your outcomes will not get better. If I really believe that I am not worthy and deserving of love and good things and positivity, as soon as I get sober and things settle down and life comes back and trust is present and my family is happy, that's going to feel uncomfortable for me because I don't believe I deserve it. So I am going to then subconsciously sabotage it, create chaos, throw bombs, do anything I can to blow it up because I need the outcome, the reality to match the story that my head is telling me. And that's the disconnect. We have to address those core beliefs, which are attached to the underlying issues. So hopefully you guys are starting to see a pattern there. But family is another huge component of this. Obviously, relapse syndrome can have a huge detrimental impact on family and relationships. They're going through all the progression as well. They're going through all the treatment attempts, the failed efforts, all the things that the person is going through. And unfortunately, sometimes family can start to lose hope and belief in their loved one because they've been through it and they've heard it so many times and they've seen it so many times. They may have the person failing before they even have an opportunity to try, and rightly so, based on what they've experienced. But they can also then create mistaken beliefs and unhealthy wiring that get fused into those dynamics, and develop a significant lack of trust due to being told one thing and another thing happening. Families sometimes less willing to engage and open to being educated because they're kind of like, been there, done that, don't need it again. The dynamics are very important when working with relapse syndrome, because if everybody in the family system stays symptomatic and we pull the person out to get treatment, but nobody else changes, and then we put them back in that environment, inevitably revert right back. And that's not the family's fault, right? Or intention. They didn't cause that. But these dynamics trigger one another warning signs. Family members have warning signs just like addicts and alcoholics do. And they tend to trigger one another. So an example for family might be control, right? My warning sign is I want to control every aspect of them staying sober. Where are you going? What are you doing? Who are you with? Can I drive you to a meeting? That warning sign would then potentially trigger the other person's warning sign to get uncomfortable, feel like you're accusing them, and lie, right? So you can see how that can kind of start to create risk. So we really, really do a lot of work with the family here and a lot of work with the dynamics so that we can help them recover and really work on understanding what relapse syndrome is, how has it affected the person, so that we can remove some of this idea that they're intentionally doing this. And let me say this, I am in no way attempting to create an escape and accountability, right? Because people with relapse syndrome absolutely need to be held accountable. They need to be responsible for their diagnosis and treated effectively. They need to make amends to the people that they have hurt. But what we don't want to do is create additional anger and frustration and resentment and hurt under a mistaken belief that they are intentionally continuously going back by choice to these substances, because oftentimes they're not consciously doing it. They don't want to do it, but they cannot figure out how to get themselves out of it. So once we have the patient in a place where they best understand their syndrome, we have them share that with their family members and loved ones where it's safe and potentially, doesn't cause harm. We want them to really have that added accountability, help the family understand so that they know how to have compassion on board, and support the patient, but also boundary setting and accountability, because that's really important. So we're always going to encourage the family to access their own support and education, whatever that looks like, so they can be mindful of their own warning signs and how to reduce risk that they're going to go into them. Most of the time, if a patient has relapse syndrome, whether the home is healthy or not, I'm not going to recommend that they go back there. I just truly believe that somebody who has chronic attempts to recover that falls into relapse or has relapse syndrome needs longer lengths of time in a structured setting and environment that is recovery oriented. It's really important if we want to produce some active change. So all that being said, I wanted to incorporate in today's presentation just some current addiction trends that we're seeing and where that, kind of connects in terms of relapse syndrome and the approach to treat relapse. So I pulled some kind of current statistics. The number of drug overdose deaths increased nearly 30% from 2019 to 2020 and has quadrupled since 1999. Nearly 75% of the 91,799 drug overdose deaths in 2020 involved an opioid. From 2019 to 2020, there were significant changes in the opioid-involved death rates. So one, opioid-involved death rates increased by 38%, prescription opioid death rates increased by 17%, heroin-involved death rates increased by 7%, and synthetic opioids increased by 56%, which was very interesting to me. So I have to keep moving this so I can see. From 1999 to 2020, more than 564,000 people died from an overdose involving an opioid, including prescription and illicit. The rise of the opioid overdose deaths appeared to have happened in 3 distinct waves. So we know the first wave became with the overprescribing of opiates in the 90s, when OxyContin was developed and marketed to physicians under the belief that it was less than 1% likelihood that the person would be addicted. It was very much viewed through the lens as this miracle drug that was going to help people have high functioning lives with chronic and acute pain, which of course didn't happen. And with changing the pain scale recommendations, people were able to get prescribed this medication for more minor injuries versus severe, which just imploded this prescription pill epidemic across the United States. The second wave began in about 2010, when the crackdown on prescription medications came in, which was great in that we shut that down, but we basically left an entire population addicted to prescription opiates without any resources. And so because of the intense cost and the limited accessibility, people made the jump to heroin, which is really where that impact came into play. And then the third wave in 2013 was with the significant overdose deaths involving the synthetic opioids, particularly those, of fentanyl that are illicitly manufactured. Overall, in total, right now, 187 people die every day from an opioid overdose, which is really staggering. More than 932,000 people have died since 1999. Nearly 75% of the deaths involved an opioid. And then obviously we're dealing with a combination of heroin, synthetic opioids like fentanyl, and that has increased more than 8 times since 99. Overdoses involving opiates killed nearly 69,000 people in 2020, and over 82% of those deaths involved synthetic opioids. So right when the pandemic hit, nearly 170,000 people over the age of 12 have tried heroin for the first time in 2013. This number has not changed much in the last decade. More than 680,000 people used heroin at some point in 2013, a number that rose steadily over 370,000 in 2007. Between 2002 and 2013, heroin use increased by 63% overall. And those increases were across the board: ages, generals, income levels. The rate of heroin use among women also doubled from 0.8 to 1.6 in a decade. These are just interesting trends to really highlight when we're looking at the circumstances. Synthetic opioids, which are obviously much like opium, but they are man-made. They're going to produce the same effects as chemical reaction in the brain. But unlike their predecessor, they are going to have a wide range of potency levels. So out of 7 million people, 5.1 regularly abuse pain-relieving drugs. Besides heroin, drugs on the list of synthetic opioids make up the bulk of the prescription medications abused. Where we saw the epidemic shift and become severely problematic was when the combo happened, where people started to cut heroin with fentanyl and other synthetic opioids. This bloomed among distributors and dealers across all substances because they recognized the payoff and the benefit for them. People were coming in believing, still are, that they're using cocaine or methamphetamine, and when the urine drug screen and the blood samples come back, it's cut with fentanyl. For a dealer, because of the intense physical dependency that gets created, it's a dream come true because the person has to continue to come back to use the substance. Heroin cut with the fentanyl is obviously going to create a much more intense euphoric effect, increased potency, and that's going to come with an increased risk for dependency and progression, unlike other overdoses. So the physical dependency is so strong that withdrawal can start as little as 4 hours from previous use. So dealers very quickly recognized the benefit to them, and almost all samples of heroin collected showed the presence of fentanyl. There are also other substances currently that are creating barriers for people who are attempting to recover. It's just not the same illness that we treated 5 years ago. Kratom, which is basically a tree in the coffee family in Southeast Asia and Africa, interacts with the brain's opioid receptors. Some people use it to relieve pain. People with opiate addictions try to use it to overcome their problem with heroin or synthetic opioids, one evil versus another. People very much tend to think incorrectly that this is safe because it's natural and derived from a plant, and it's also legal and easily obtainable in many states without the stigma attached of narcotics or addiction. People think it's okay, but it has the same risk factors for dependency. It basically mimics what fentanyl and other synthetic opioids do in the brain. It comes with severe withdrawal, and people are starting to recognize that they've got themselves in a bad situation after a period of time using it. You can drink it, you can chew leaves. It can basically be found in resins, extracts, pill capsules, powders, even drinks. There are in some states actual bars dedicated to serving drinks with kratom in it. The challenges with this is that the FDA, although it's caught up a little bit and made it illegal in about 6 states, it remains legal and readily available in all other states in smoke shops, gas stations, and stores. People really think that it's just recreational because of the accessibility, but it really is causing a lot of dependency. We're seeing it more and more come into play, and a lot of treatment centers are still learning about the impact of this substance on the brain and the withdrawal process. People are not always sure if they should treat it the same way as an opioid because it's different receptors, but the withdrawal certainly mimics the same symptoms. And it can also come with some serious medical consequences when used chronically, like cardiac concerns, liver damage and failure, and brain disease. Obviously, in recent years, the focus and all we've talked about in current trends has been on overdoses, fatal overdoses related to fentanyl and heroin. Currently, there is a new trend emerging with xylazine. This drug is a sedative that is basically an animal tranquilizer, typically used for heavy animals like elephants and rhinoceros, that is not FDA approved for use in humans. Fentanyl is obviously still a major concern, but recent toxicology has shown that over 90% of the dope samples is showing the presence of xylazine, causing another spike in opiate-related deaths. We have the DEO estimating that it was involved in at least 1,281 overdose deaths in the Northeast, 1,423 in the South in 2021, and was present in more than 1 in 10 overdose deaths. Because xylazine is not an opiate, Narcan does not reverse the side effects of the drugs and help people to come out of an overdose. It's still recommended to give the Narcan because the hope is that it'll still have opiate in it. But this is going to cause a new wave of destruction in terms of the overdose crisis. It's basically a tranquilizer, and it's readily available and easy supply, and really causing a problem across the United States. We really have to get to a place where we recognize early on that this is happening and try to get in front of it. But due to its impact, basically, the White House Office of National Drug Policy is calling this an emerging threat. It's now being called tranq dope. That is the new term or language being used when the sedative of xylazine is being mixed with heroin. Other drugs like cocaine, fentanyl can also be mixed with xylazine, either to enhance the drug's effects or increase the street value. People may not be aware that xylazine is in the drug that they are using, and it has a high risk for dependency. But basically, the DEA has seized xylazine and fentanyl mixtures in 48 out of the 50 states. DEA laboratory systems report that approximately 23% of fentanyl powder and 7% of fentanyl pills seized in 2022 contain xylazine. Xylazine can be injected, snorted, sniffed, or swallowed, same kind of thing. So we are in it currently. In 2021, there was a study conducted by the City Public Health Department that found traces in more than 90% of the samples of dope for the mix of illicit drugs. And the percentage of fatal opiate overdoses with xylazine rose 276% And so, you know, from January 2019 through June 2022, the Center for Disease Control and Prevention is tracking this and showing that it is doubling and increasing across the United States. And basically, people are getting this on the street in bulk amounts at high levels because of how intense the dependency and euphoria is from the drug. It's increasingly found laced in illegal supplies of fentanyl, which is increasing the potency and blamed for about over 70,000% of the overdose deaths in 2021. So you can just hear in the statistics how staggering it is. Crank dope is obviously of the biggest concern. This is the biggest growing threat, the drug combination between heroin and xylazine. The new findings are basically showing that there's a dramatic rise, 30% increase in deadly drug overdoses from 2019 to 2020, the largest such increase ever recorded. This is causing a new wave of destruction in a lot of ways. And if you're looking specifically at overdoses, since 2018, the death rates for xylazine increased significantly, especially among men. 3,468 deaths, 73% of them were men. Despite the increased detection in the overdoses, there's really no evidence that the tranq itself increases the risk for death. It's the combination and the mixture that's creating risk factors for people. There are obviously a lot of negative side effects with it. People who use it continuously can manifest these open wounds with black dead tissue that, if left untreated, can lead to limb amputation. So where you thought Kensington was bad before, looking like a zombie town, people are actually losing limbs over this drug. The first responders are just flooded and inundated with wound care concerns across the board. And like I said, because it's not an opiate, Narcan doesn't reverse the overdose effects, which is going to increase the stats and risk factors for increased overdose deaths. It basically causes major risks around lowering the user's blood pressure, heart rate, and respirations. So when you're mixing that with an opiate, it comes with the highest level of concern. It also, when used for long periods of time, can cause people to lapse into long blackouts that last for hours. And by the time they come to or are consciously aware of what's happening, their effects have already worn off and their desperation for more have kicked in. It is a very severe drug that can cause withdrawal in as little as 2 hours since last use, 2 to 4 hours. Reports show that the withdrawal is more intense than your standard opiate or synthetic opiate and can last up to 10 to 12 days, and that post-acute withdrawal can last up to an additional 2 weeks. Again, because it's not an opiate, you can't use things like naloxone, Suboxone to really help with the sedative part of the detox and the euphoric recall and the intense urges. So people are struggling. They're struggling with the wait time to get into a treatment provider. The impact that it's having in the 4 months they have to wait to get a bed is detrimental. And then when they do finally land in treatment, they're not feeling like their withdrawal is effectively treated. They're taking flight. They're not able to manage it. I think people are still kind of learning how to deal with this within the treatment setting, especially for the detoxification process. But while there's obviously a lot of current dope trends, the fentanyl trend, the prescription pill, the xylazine, people with relapse syndrome, it does tend to be a primary diagnosis in that group, opiate use disorder. The challenges with that when dealing with treating relapse are going to include post-acute withdrawal. The level of discomfort that happens causes them to want to take flight very impulsively and very quickly. It also impacts their engagement. It tends to be lower because their motivation is impacted. The chemical imbalance in the brain really causes a low drive. They have a very difficult time managing overwhelming emotions because of the intense euphoric impact that an opiate has. As well as that euphoric recall. It really causes a lot of difficulty for them to settle down and stabilize within the process. The RPT approach can be difficult as a result of that because it's sort of designed to trigger up a little bit of stress and activate their warning signs while they're in the group. So normally we will not start engaging someone in that process until they've stabilized from detox and all levels of withdrawal, and they have the capability of keeping that logic on board. And a little bit more tolerance built up for dealing with or managing discomfort. So that's kind of how that separates out. Clinical interventions based on substance. So when you're looking with the opiates because of the intense euphoria, the recall, the urge to use, the cravings, and the difficulty with emotion, you're going to see higher AMA rates and you're going to see lower tolerance levels for stress. Your interventions are going to want to be based on impulse management, teaching them how to separate out their urge from their action, that they can really want to get high, but actually go to bed sober. Two very different things. That MAT is always really encouraged and helpful when treating relapse syndrome, especially for opiate use disorder. Holistic coping skills or a person-centered approach is really encouraged. And the identification of warning signs earlier in with stress management really helps with the opiate diagnosis. The other trend that is on the rise is methamphetamine. I don't know if anybody else is recognizing this, but more than 1.6 million people reported using meth in the past year. It's much cheaper, it's more potent, and it's consumed across a wider geographic swath in the United States, right? So it's also killing more people than ever before. In some areas, more than fentanyl, which is insane. 2019 estimates the number of chronic methamphetamine use increased from 2.2 million in 2006 to 3.2 million in 2016. There were more users of meth than cocaine or heroin that year, and more than twice the number of meth users than the low point in 2008. Why do we believe this is happening? They believe that the increase is that, number one, it's about 71% cheaper than it was previously. Users can obtain 100% pure meth for about $5 a hit. The root cause, they believe, is this major shift in the resurgence of meth use in the supply chain. Once they shut down the use of pseudoephedra in the cold medicines and these mom and pop meth shops got shut down, it opened up opportunities for the Mexican cartels and for people who were distributing on a larger scale, which basically opened a new wave for the meth to come in as way more potent and way more accessible. The popularity, it's interesting. I'll see a lot of people who were primarily opiate use disorder come back with a primary meth disorder, and they will literally say, I just don't want to deal with everything that comes with opiate use anymore. This xylazine is scary. I don't want to deal with the wound issues. I don't want to deal with the risk of dying. So they literally switch substances. It's insane to think about, right? You're concerned about your health and well-being while you're shooting a certain drug, but that's the insanity of the disease and the way they think. So people are fueling more into a methamphetamine addiction right now. The overdose impact in the western half of the U.S. is obviously playing a bigger factor in the fatal overdoses, more than fentanyl. Meth was the main drug involved in overdose deaths in 19 states west of the Mississippi River in 2017, whereas nationally, fentanyl ranked number one in the overdose deaths. One report estimated that more than 10,000 people died in the U.S. as a result of meth overdoses in 2017. Deaths most likely are caused by heart attack, stroke, and multiple organ failures due to extremely high blood pressure in the body. When you're looking at methamphetamine and the way it relates to relapse syndrome, you're going to see a much higher increase of taking flight due to intense preoccupation and obsession. Where with opiates, it's much more physically and emotionally driven. With meth, it's mental. There is such a powerful pull to use the drug. They have all of these racing and impaired thoughts and impact within the frontal lobe that it makes it really difficult for them to not feed into reactions and urges. They also, on the flip side, have a very high tolerance for stress because we know the impact of meth is going to be you're heightened, you're energized, you're engaged, you're functional in their mind. And that is going to lead to an adaptation of operating under so many different factors of chaos. So your clinical interventions are going to want to be around impulse management and application of skills. What are we actually going to do here? DBT having one of the best impacts. Identifying problematic thinking patterns and processing issues so we can make sense of what's happening for them. And then, of course, identifying stress triggers and working on asking for help. So being able to slow down and really help people get to a place where they're open and willing to connect on another level, because that's what produces the biggest power to change. The cravings and urges are always going to be very strong. So if we can teach them to challenge their poor judgment and remain engaged in the treatment process despite their discomfort, they're going to build more and more tolerance the longer they engage in the treatment process and start to really buy in or believe in their own ability to stop themselves from acting on decisions that create harm. But this can also, create additional challenges with the work, because the work is going to reactivate that urge to do what they know how to do. And that's also why it is so effective. But ultimately, I believe we are dealing with a very different animal today than we have been in the past. Socioeconomic status is no longer a factor when you're dealing with substance use disorder. People are getting hit across the board on higher end areas with more money, more resources, which can lead to additional entitlement and justification. People with money and resources can tend to stay sick for longer periods of time. They can bail out family members, which causes them to stay sick for longer. There are all these components and factors that are feeding into play when it comes to the treatment environment that are very interesting to highlight. The legalization of marijuana has also created additional barriers. A lot of people in recovery are always going to be looking for loopholes and getting over, under, and around the one thing they don't want to accept, which is you cannot successfully use drugs and alcohol. Things like legalization of marijuana open up avenues for justification around, I need this, it's prescribed, it's going to help me with A, B, and C. Other legalized substances like the kratom, it's the same thing. Those types of things weren't necessarily there before. So it's adding an increased challenge for people, especially young adults. The other piece to mention is that the industry has become very treatment saturated for commercial payers or for people who have the ability to self-pay, but not for people with Medicaid or lower socioeconomic status. They're still having significant wait times to access treatment. We still are in high need of resources because they're limited. And even though harm reduction is very helpful, it's not going to produce the long-term change in outcome that we really need. Treatment being oversaturated is very much oftentimes catering to a luxury-based model that isn't necessarily focused on quality clinical, which can kind of fuel some of the disorder and cause people to take these short-term approaches to treatment when really we need long-term engagement to produce optimal outcomes. When we're looking at relapse prevention outcome, obviously each drug is going to present a different set of its own unique challenges and barriers. We know that. But we also know across the board that no matter what your primary substance of choice is, no matter what you're dealing with co-occurring wise, trauma wise, if you are honest, open-minded, willing, and accept every aspect of treatment and the direction you're given, you will definitely have better outcomes. In 15 years in treating relapsers, have never met someone who was actively engaged in a program, doing everything they were supposed to do, relapse. It just doesn't happen. We really want them to work towards that 90% success rate and stay in treatment more long-term, because we know that to be true. So in today's challenges, like we mentioned, you're always going to want to push for a longer length of stay. You're going to want to challenge the patient on what they need versus what they want. Kind of this long-standing approach of longer lengths of stay produce better outcome, even though it sounds a little archaic, is still very much true. And because of things today like financial distress and all the low resources, it makes it hard for someone to engage in treatment. So we really have to work hard to keep people fighting for what they need to get well. But I'm a true believer that as long as there's breath in your body, there's hope to recover. These are some of your overall facts. So 46.3 million people age 12 or older met the DSM criteria for having a substance use disorder in the past year, including 29.5 who were classified as having an alcohol use disorder, 24 million for substance abuse. The percentage of people who were classified as having a past year substance use disorder, including alcohol, was highest among young adults ages 18 to 25 as compared to 26 and older. In 2021, 94% of people aged 12 or older with a substance use disorder did not receive treatment. 94%. Nearly all people with a substance use disorder who did not get treatment at a specialty facility did not think they needed treatment. So that just shows all the fueling factors we discussed. Recovery statistics, 7 in 10 or 72% adults who had a substance abuse problem consider themselves in recovery. 2 in 3 or 66.5% or 38 million adults who have ever had a mental health issue consider themselves in recovery. Unfortunately, less than 42% of individuals who seek treatment for drug addiction do not complete it. However, it is important in these statistics to really consider how a person views what recovery is. What you can do if there are clinicians on here is really just stay educated and up to date with current trends, what's popping up, take as many trainings as you can on it, and also what are the best evidence-based modalities to use. Really understand and consider the change in culture that we're witnessing with treating this diagnosis today, and stay connected to a community of other clinical providers so that we can kind of work together to really stay informed with the best possible approach. I also believe that utilizing a trauma-informed care approach will definitely increase outcomes. Your best possible overall, start in the highest level of care, transition slowly, consider the whole person, everything we're looking at, individualize the treatment plan, involve the family, and really look at aftercare for sober living or extended treatment for the best possible outcomes. 96% of addicts or people with substance abuse also have unresolved trauma. Again, not the reason they have the addiction, but those unresolved issues create increased risk for substance abuse and relapse. So the trauma-informed approach that I mentioned can significantly help them stay open, engaged, and lean into the treatment process the way they need to. And I'll kind of wrap with this understanding of what I call the 4 R's. These are kind of essential or perhaps ethical norms when it comes to being an agency or a provider that is working from a trauma-informed approach. 1, we need to realize that trauma has extensive impacts on individuals and really understand that there are multiple paths to recovery so that we're not doing a one-size-fits-all approach. 2, we need to recognize the unique symptoms and the way they manifest when it comes to trauma or traumatic stress, not just for individuals, but groups, communities, cultures, and staff. Staff is also heavily impacted. 3, we need to respond by paying attention, implementing policies, procedures, and practices that are guided by trauma-informed principles. And 4, we have to, number 1, most importantly, resist re-traumatizing our patients. So these are helpful things to all keep in mind when you're considering the best possible approach with a patient. And I wanted to make sure we left some time for question and answer, but I know I just threw a ton of information at you all in a short period of time. Hopefully it all made sense and kind of came together the way we needed it to, but I wanted to make sure we opened it up and see if anybody had questions or discussion or anything like that.
Yes, that was overwhelming. That was an amazing amount of information. You really presented it in such a clear way, and I really appreciate you getting into the trends. So thank you for helping us with that. That was also really comprehensive. I want to invite folks, if you wouldn't mind stop sharing just so we can get a better look at our participants.
Oh, yeah.
That would be great. Thanks.
Sure.
Folks, feel free to unmute yourselves and jump in with a question. Use the raise hand would be really appreciated. Help us out a little bit with that if you have a question. I see Helen. Go right ahead, Helen.
What is the feeling about medical assisted recovery?
As it pertains to the relapse syndrome treatment?
Yes.
Yeah. So Gorski has always been a huge fan of medication assisted treatment as long as it's used in combination with other modalities. I think the only risk factor is when people, like things like Vivitrol work so well. When I hear people with relapse syndrome, they'll say, okay, well, this is really all I need. And then they put total reliance and dependency on the MAT and they stop all the other avenues of recovery, then it actually creates risk. But,
do you think there's been an increased problem with people not continuing with some kind of a program in their life if they're on medical assisted recovery because they've opened it up for all doctors to be able to prescribe?
I do. I think that the way it's not regulated right now from a recovery standpoint, a lot of people with this diagnosis want the quickest possible fix where they're not exposed and they don't have to do as much work. That's just the nature of the disease. So those doctors open up avenues for that, and where they're treating the medical component of it and the issues around cravings and usage, none of the other aspects are getting treated. So I think that definitely plays a factor into those chronic relapse cycles that we see.
Jessica, do you think there'd ever be a time when doctors would be required to have, like sometimes when people are going to AA for the first time, they have to get it signed? The courts ask them to get it signed. Where doctors who are prescribing this have to make sure that they sign on to recommend and not recommend, insist that the people go to some kind of program?
I sure hope so. I think that would really help significantly for people to understand if they're going to want to go the avenue of MAT, they're going to be expected and accountable and mandated to engage in some type of recovery program. Whether or not that will happen, I'm not sure, but I think there's going to be enough evidence to suggest that it needs to happen, because we're going to see a lot of people who are going to fuel stats that are negative or with poor outcomes if they're only using MAT to implement treating their symptoms. So I'm a huge advocate for that. I love MAT, but I really believe it has to be used in combination in conjunction with all other aspects of therapy, recovery, meetings. I think if people are relying solely on MAT and then they get off the MAT and they don't have any support network established, I've seen them go right back to using their active drug of choice within days. So it's crucial for them to have success. And I also don't think everybody's appropriate for it. I think we really have to screen and discern who would fit the best model for buprenorphine, Sublocade. You're going to want to look at people who have had several attempts that are unsuccessful, that are chronic, that are overdose risk, not your average first time in treatment just because they're an opiate addict, if that makes sense.
Thanks a lot. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for that question.
Just there's a question in the chat, which is actually a perfect segue into this. You referenced 12-step fellowships, and many treatment programs do really strongly recommend 12-step fellowships. But how do we approach, the question is, how do we approach our clients who don't respond to the 12-step philosophies?
Yeah, that's a classic, right? We've seen that from day one and we'll continue to see it forever. And I'm open a lot more than I was before with that, because I think although AA and NA are quite effective, they can be a little archaic in language and experience. And so I think the newer generation does struggle. So I'm a big believer in never telling someone, if you don't go to AA and NA, you're going to relapse. I usually just say to them, look, we know hands down across the board that you need some kind of network or sober program of support, whatever that looks like for you. You need something, right? Because the core belief around positive outcomes for recovery is one addict alcoholic connecting to another through shared lived experience. So I usually just say, let's look at where your resistance is with the 12 steps, and let's look at alternative options like Refuge or SMART or Celebrate, because there has to be something that you are willing to tap into or relate to be able to be successful. And if across the board, it's like, I don't like any of them, then you're dealing with a bigger issue that isn't necessarily just about the 12 steps.
Yes, somebody mentioned Recovery Dharma is one of those.
Yes, Dharma as well. Mm-hmm.
Right.
May I say something again, Kim, if you don't mind? Sorry. I know my son was talking with someone recently who has been in and out of recovery. And he said, oh, I want to go to Dharma recovery, which is what my son does and loves it. And my son said, you've got to first learn your steps, your 12 steps to understand your disease, and then you can move on to Dharma. So that was his recommendation to this person. You've not had success so far, let's do the 12 steps, then go into Dharma.
Yeah, I think it's the community. The disease itself is fueled by isolation. So like whatever your community of choice is, I think they just really need the connection and relatability to be successful, and the accountability as well. So that's a really interesting way to put it. I think it's nice to be able to have exposure to the 12 steps at least before you decide you don't like it. We have to try something at least once.
Okay, we have another couple of great questions in the chat. What is your response to clients who use marijuana but are otherwise sober and appear to be doing well?
This is kind of a hot button topic that is coming up all over. I'm getting calls from employers that are like, I own, a series of daycares where the employees are showing up high and I can't do anything about it because they have a legal script to use the marijuana, but clearly they appear under the influence. And they're working with kids, right? So there's all these kind of issues arising around this. I see it the same way I see opiates. If someone has a legitimate reason, which I think should be pretty chronic and severe, and they've tried every other avenue that's holistic and non-narcotic in their approach that has been unsuccessful, and they're using it exactly the way it was intended, and it's not disrupting their functioning and their relationships and their life, that it's fine. But I think that when it's causing impairment, or you're appearing to be misusing or abusing based on change in affect and personality and your functioning, that it's the same issue as you're dealing with someone who's abusing an opiate. And I think anybody with a substance use disorder cannot successfully use marijuana to treat other issues, just like we wouldn't recommend, taking Adderall because it's a narcotic, or taking an opiate or a benzodiazepine, right? We want to stay away from narcotic mood altering based meds.
Okay, thank you.
Mhm.
Here's a question about xylazine. Why do people like xylazine? Does it make the high better and last longer?
I thought the same thing when I was if you start doing research on it, some of the images are pretty disturbing. And I work with a lot of first responders who are talking to me about the wounds that are occurring. And it just seems insane. It does show in the research that the potency is greater, the high lasts longer. I ultimately don't think people are intentionally using it. I think that it's being cut in majority of the dope and they didn't even realize it. And then once they were in it, they were in it. And now they have no choice. But I'm not sure how much of the population would be like looking forward to using xylazine. But if they did, I would, guess that it makes the high last longer and is a little bit more strong and euphoric. It seems to me all it really does is knock them out. It seems to take them out of a conscious awareness for several hours. And when they wake up, they just have to get high again. So it's another wave of generation that's just going to be completely disconnected from life. It's really sad.
Absolutely. It's heartbreaking. Question, how widespread is the relapse prevention therapy in treatment facilities, and also is it being used in outpatient programs?
It's a great question. I wish that it was more used in treatment facilities. Gorski used to travel around himself and build the programs in, and then I guess that got to be too much. So he developed the relapse prevention training that he offers to clinicians and other recovering individuals so that they can then take it back to their facilities. So once you're certified, like me, you end up on a list on the site, which allows you to access resources all over the country. I will tell you they're pretty limited. I've called so many of them local to Pennsylvania, and they're either retired, they don't currently practice, or they just don't use the certification. I know Karen Treatment Centers does some form of the Gorski model, and Father Martin Ashley. But those are the only two facilities that I'm aware of in the tri-state area that also use the Gorski model within the inpatient substance abuse program. We at Meermont developed it in our PHP, our IOP, and our outpatient at all sites, because that was one of the things that I identified was missing when I was doing it in inpatient. It's really meant to be a long-term model clinically that the person engages in over time, that we were shoving into 28 days. And we wanted them to really have that continuum to keep working on it when they left. So yes, it's used in our outpatient model. I'm not sure about the other treatment programs, but I think it's very effective used in an outpatient level of care for any individual practice clinicians on here. If you're interested and you like the training, I definitely recommend checking out his website. His training, even though he has passed, sadly, his understudy Roland has taken over and Grinstead, and they still offer it. So it's definitely worth it. Once I took it, it changed the entire way I do addiction treatment. And I really believe in it. I've seen it work wonders for people.
And thanks for all the resources you provided, Jess. I've added those to that follow-up page, which Bob just put in the chat, that has all the, how to learn more about the Gorski method and some of the educational resources. Please ask any other questions. I have a question for you. I'm wondering what your thoughts are about the association of nicotine or cigarette smoking, because there are some studies that show the increased risk for relapse of an SUD with cigarette smoking. I don't know if vaping comes into that as well. I would imagine so. Any thoughts about that?
Yeah, that's a good question. Gorski actually has a book. I think it's also in the Staying Sober book, but he has another book. I forget the name of it. It's on his website. And it talks about that. It talks about all of these behaviors when people get sober that they tend to fall into that can increase the risk factors. Nicotine is definitely one of them. However, I will say I'm never going to tell someone like stop it all at once, because I think sometimes it's a bit much. But I think if you're a smoker and you're getting into recovery, it's important to look at options and opportunities to consider quitting or cutting down. It's about the behavior, and nicotine is also mind mood altering, right? And the other things he highlights in there are energy drinks. I see people all the time in early recovery drinking 4 or 5 energy drinks a day. Sugar, caffeine, all of it are ways that you can just creatively find other avenues for impulsivity with getting a hit. And he talks about the importance around balance with nutrition and wellness and self-care, because all of those things will likely increase risk. And I hear it with the relapsers we treat all the time, where they'll say, like, suddenly I was buying NyQuil all the time, or, they were just like little tiny things that get dismissed as no big deal, because they're not until they are definitely come into play. So I would say yes. Mhm.
Right. Other questions, folks? I'll ask another one if nobody else does. You mentioned housing, which I really appreciate. If you could just speak more about the importance of recovery housing for that long-term, like if that's something that's showing better outcomes, obviously length of stay of treatment is one thing, but then the housing can be really crucial, I believe, too. Yes.
Yeah, definitely. I think the recent stats in the CRS, the Certified Recovery Training, was that if you leave treatment with no aftercare support, the likelihood of sobriety is 3%. If you go to sober living, it goes up to 76%. So there is definitely clear evidence that a transition to either an extended care like PHP sleepover or sober housing is going to significantly help outcomes. I think, learning to individualize it to the person. Some people benefit from more treatment where they really have to learn how to rehabilitate. They need some help around basic life skills in recovery. How do I, apply for a job sober? How do I start all those things, all encompassing. And then the sober house is more the network and community of support within your everyday life and the structure. Someone having accountability around curfew and chores and commitments and service and meeting attendance, and just really being immersed in a house and in relationship with other people who are working towards the same common goal. I just find that it really helps people take what they've done in the relapse prevention program and make it applicable to their everyday recovery process. It seems like that happens quicker and more effectively and efficiently when they're in a sober house versus going home. It's very easy when they leave to be like, oh, I just know now. I'm not going to do it again. And oftentimes it's like one of the things that activates their progression is change. And we tend to see that kick up when they're getting ready to transition to the next level of care, because now you're leaving inpatient. Nobody's there to tell you what to do, how to do it, when to go to group. All the responsibility falls on you. You have to go back to work. You have to go back to your relationships, and that's stressful. And the risk is it's going to activate your warning signs. And so really crucial with transition that you have as much support on possible. And I think that sober housing really should be recommended for everybody personally, but
Be nice. In a perfect world, we could
yes.
control these things. Wouldn't that be amazing? Oh gosh. Well, barring any other questions, Bob just put everything in the chat that you need to know. There's the evaluation form, the follow-up page that has a recording that'll be available probably later today. It takes a little while to process. Jess's PowerPoint, thank you for sharing that, is there as well, as long as with some of those resources.
And I put my personal cell and email on there if anybody needs any follow-up from me or any guidance or direction around the training, or if you just, want to ask a question you didn't want to ask here, I'm happy to be a resource anytime.